And we're slating this interview with Roger Williams on June 7th, 2009. Roger, thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to ask you the obvious question that you've probably been asked many, many times. Going back to Autumn Leaves, that's going to be your trademark, probably forever. Now, tell us, if you would, the story of how Autumn Leaves came to be.
Well, Autumn Leaves started with a call from my record company on a Friday night. They said they were recording Jane Morgan on Monday. And she only had 3 songs ready. And they said, you know, Autumn Leaves. And I said, you mean Falling Leaves? I didn't even know the title. And so I stayed up Friday night, I stayed up Saturday night, I stayed up Sunday night, and finally got the arrangement to Marty Gold. And Jane came in the next day. She had a baseball bat over her shoulder and shorts on and a blouse that went out to here. She was gorgeous. And I don't think the orchestra ever watched their music once during the recording session. And when she got through, why, they said, we have only 11 minutes left. And they said, we don't even have time to rehearse this song. Let's just record it. So I sat down to a piano that I had never played on a bench I had never sat on, and went through. And believe it or not, it turned out great, except that it was 3 minutes and 3 seconds long. And in those days, a disc jockey would never play a song that was over 3 minutes. So they said out of the control room, we have room for one more take. Can you play those a little faster? Which I did. 2:59.
Wow.
And I went home, and my fondest dream was that that record would pay the rent for the last 2 months, which we owed. And I had, well, Laura was here today, my daughter. We had this little baby, Laura, and they were about to throw us out of the apartment. And it's been paying the rent ever since. Wow. You never know.
Now, on this whole thing of Autumn Leaves, you actually did not just the piano part, but do I understand correctly that you also did the orchestration?
No, I did not do the orchestration. I got the orchestration ready Sunday night.
Oh, I see.
But you see, it's hard to say orchestration because I will give an orchestrator a piece of music, and I'll put the chords on it and the bass notes that I want, and say, now I want the trumpet section to do this, I want the violins to come here and play this, and then they just do it and copy the whole thing out for the musicians. But actually, I arranged everything that I do.
Wow, that's fantastic. Now, you've had, besides Autumn Leaves, of course, all the wonderful things, Almost Paradise, and Maria, and Laras Theme, and most recently, The Rose, and Somewhere in Time. Do you select the items that you record, or does the record company come to you and say, this is what we want you to do?
That's a particular talent that the head of the record company had, David Kapp. If he heard a song, he thought it had a chance. I remember when he came to me with The Impossible Dream. And I heard The Impossible Dream, and I said, well, I kind of like Dulcinea from that show. So I recorded Dulcinea, and he gave The Impossible Dream to Jack Jones. So, you know, remember Frank Sinatra saying to me that he heard Nature Boy. They brought it to him first. And he said, I thought it was, you know, just another song. So they gave it to Nat Cole, and Sinatra regretted it ever since.
Wow. Well, I have to ask you about, again, going back to this idea of arrangements and so forth. Can you walk us through how you came to the arrangement? One of my particular favorites is the Laras Theme arrangement that you did.
Yes.
How did that come about? How did you arrive at that particular, which is so different from anybody else?
Well, I have to fall in love with the thing like I did Somewhere in Time. I fell in love with Dr. Zhivago. It was the first time that I had ever seen adultery treated in a kind way. You know, Zhivago was very happily married. He had children, and his wife was a sweetheart. But he, on his work, he found this girl, and they fell in love. These things happen in life, and we're very harsh to judge people. I never cheated on my wives, but I have great compassion for people that fall in love. Sometimes even within a marriage, it's tough on them. They pay the price, believe me. Zhivago paid the price. But I love that movie, and I'll never forget when she left in the sleigh. They took her away, and he looked out the window and knew that's the last time that he'd ever see her. And I thought of that when I made the arrangement.
Wonderful. Again, speaking of orchestration and arrangers, if we could pay homage to a couple of people that you've worked with over the years, just a few comments about how they are and how you enjoyed working with them. Let's say Frank Hunter.
Well, Frank Hunter. Now, who's that guy that you are representing? Tell me.
Well, one Mr. Farnan.
I'm just kidding. Frank said Farnan was the greatest arranger in the whole world. And he said he's from England, and he said, I get every record that he's ever made, and I hope someday to be able to arrange like him. And I said, Frank, I think you're practically doing it now. I think you're great. And we did a lot of stuff together, but I never did work with Farnan because I never got over there, and he never got over to where I was at the time.
Yeah. What about Marty Gold?
Marty Gold is such a wonderful man. He still calls me. He's still alive. He's one of the few. Well, Ralph Carmichael is still alive, too. But most of these guys, Frank Hunter is dead. Yeah. And most of all the arrangers that I worked with over the years are gone. You're great jazz arrangers. And
Marty Gold have any special techniques that he threw in that you liked? Or?
No, but he had a feel for what I did.
Okay.
You see now, like after I played today, you said you really got a feeling. I made you feel. And evidently I make certain orchestrators and arrangers feel. And so they just kind of meld into what I'm doing. And those are the guys I'm looking for.
Glenn Osser.
Well, he's the one that did Autumn Leaves. But he was doing Jane Morgan's session.
Oh.
And they just threw him in on the weekend because she didn't have all the songs ready. She only had 3 songs ready.
Hal Canner?
Oh, gee, Hal Canner. What a guy. Yeah, we worked a lot of times together. He's dead now, too.
And then, of course, Ralph Carmichael.
Yeah. Well, he's probably the greatest Christian orchestrator that's ever lived. I don't know how many religious albums he's made. Beautiful things. He has tremendous feeling. And when we work together, why, I can just see him up there. He just follows everything I do. And he holds everybody back, and everything works.
Now, Roger, when you perform with a large orchestra today in venues, who is your conductor of choice?
Well, I can't say it's my conductor of choice, but it's me.
Oh! All right. So you're there with the orchestra.
Yes, I conduct.
Wonderful. Now, most recently, Reader's Digest has let you go back into the studio to do some new recordings with a full orchestra, and some are brand new songs that we've not heard before, and others are some of the old favorites. How did this Reader's Digest relationship come to be?
Well, they came to me and they said, we'd like you to do an album. And I said, fine. They said, how about the symphony over in London, England? So we went over there and recorded the whole album there. And it turned out great. Ralph went with me and did the arranging, but we used all the British musicians.
My goodness. Well, I have to tell you something. Your daughter Laura has described you as one of the very first fusion musicians. In other words, combining classical to jazz to everything in between. Now, in today's musical world, I have to ask you, when you perform, do you get people from the hardcore classical coming over and saying, boy, you're playing too much jazz, or the jazz people coming over and saying you're playing too classical sounding? I mean, is it hard to play for an audience today that seem to be very hardcore in one section or the other?
I hate to put labels on anything. I hate to put labels on religion. I hate to play, especially in music. I was thrown out of Drake at one time because I played Smoke Gets in Your Eyes for my girlfriend in the practice room. And the head of the piano department walked in and said, "We don't do this here." He said, "We play Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms." So I was out. So I've always had that feeling that I wanted to bring all kinds of music to people. I want them to appreciate it all. I listen to everything. Rap is a little hard for me because actually we've taken music out of the schools. And kids don't have any education. Now, when I was in grade school, we had to put our head on the desk and listen to Walter Damrosch and the New York Philharmonic every week for a half hour. Half of us went to sleep, but we got a good musical education. Kids don't have that now. They don't have it in the schools. It's really sad. They've taken music out of the schools and supplanted it with science, and it's tough. So kids have gone back to the most basic music there is, which is a beat and a chant. Now that describes rap and hip-hop, because they have like 3 chords in the whole thing, and the rest is just a chant.
And a repetitive pattern
again and again.
over and over.
Yeah.
Well, switching gears, I'd like to say for the people who don't know this, but you've performed for all of our major presidents since Harry Truman. And I'm curious about that when you have performed for the presidents, and I always say that music is a window to the soul. Mm-hmm. Have the presidents come up to you, and have you ever found out either what their favorite piece of music is, or the kind of music that they like?
Yeah. One of my favorite presidents was the first one I played for, Harry Truman. And I don't know if you know that story, but I played for him for nearly an hour, and he asked for everything from Bach to Shostakovich. He had studied piano as a child. I didn't know that. And when I got through, he said, "Now, Roger, I'm going to play for you." And I thought he'd play the Missouri Waltz or something like that. He sat down and he played the Chopin C-sharp minor waltz. Made a couple little goofs in the middle, but he played it beautifully. And when he got through, I said, "Mr. President, you would have made a great pianist." And boy, he just snapped back at me. He said, "You know, a hell of a lot of people wish I'd stuck with it." And then he winked at me. And he said, "You know, when I first started to play, I had a choice of being a whorehouse pianist or a politician." And he said, "Many times I thought I made the wrong decision in the present." Because he had a tough time. He had to drop that bomb on millions of people practically in Japan. And I said, "Doesn't that bother you, Mr. P?" He said, "I sleep well at night," because he said, "I knew of all the American lives that I saved." He said the Japanese were ready to give their very lives to the last moment, or to the last men when we went over there. And he said, by dropping the bomb, he said, I saved a lot of lives, American lives. And he said they elected me president. And that's what my job was.
Now, there's also a very poignant story that you have about John F. Kennedy and the day that he was assassinated.
Yes.
Would you share that with us for those who have not read that?
Well, he and Jackie, well, in the first place, he collected a lot of my albums. And he used to have this little portable record player that he carried with him. And he, the night before his death, he and Jackie, they checked into this hotel in Fort Worth, not Dallas. Beautiful hotel. I forget the name of it. And the next morning while he was shaving, he put my record of Yellow Bird on the turntable and played it while he shaved. And Jackie got ready for that big parade that they were excited about. And they tell me that was the last music he ever heard. So when you make these records, you have no idea how they're going to end up. You just make them. When I went down to New Orleans and played with the symphony down there, Why, in my concert today, I mentioned that I made a record called Temptation, which never was played. And Saturday night after the concert, while we went down to the French Quarter, and all of a sudden I heard Temptation coming out of one of the strip joints. And I thought, gee whiz. I went in, and here was this girl taking off her clothes to My Temptation. And I asked the waitress, well, who's that girl? She said, that's Roger Williams. And she said, she's Roger Williams. Now we have Johnny Carson coming on right after her. And every one of these girls took the name of someone that they admired. And Roger came over to the table and told me that she really loved my music. I said, well, I've got a matinee tomorrow. Bring your boyfriend, which she did. But you never know when you do these things, how they're going to end up and who's going to play them. That's one of the great thrills and one of the great shocks of being a musician.
Well, speaking of that, I'd like to move ahead a little bit and have you talk about some of the newer members of the club, so to speak, that are involved today. I've seen your name mentioned with Chick Corea, David Foster, and now David Benoit.
Yes.
What's going on there?
I listen to everybody, and I admire so many of these musicians. I think Chick Corea is one of the great musicians of our century. And he mentioned in an interview that he'd give anything for my left hand.
Well, I think we all would.
And I said to Chick, I'll trade you my left hand for your left brain. Because he is so creative, wonderful man. But who was it that Beethoven used to say, I steal from everybody? So do I. I listen to everybody. And sometimes just a couple little notes will give me a whole new path to go.
Well, again, your daughter Laura has talked about when David Foster, who's Canadian, came down here to this country, you immediately recognized some talent there.
Yes.
And so have you...
I wouldn't do a session unless he was on second piano.
That's something. That's something. And now David Benoit, who's really considered jazz or new age and so forth. And so what's the story there?
Well, I just told him round off the edges of this square. I said, I played all this same thing for years now. I said, I want to round off the edges a little. And he came over and gave me a few ideas. Wonderful man.
Wow. The Steinway Piano Company is, again, you're going to be associated with Steinway as you have been with Autumn Leaves. But I understand that they have put out a limited edition Roger Williams piano.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, they've never done that before to an artist. They've never put out a piano with an artist's name on it. Now, Horowitz had his own piano that they, just a regular Steinway that he loved, and so did Rubinstein and all the great artists. But they made one for me, which was wonderful. And they gave me the first Lifetime Achievement Award that they'd ever given to. So they've been awfully good to me, and I'm very loyal to people that I like.
That's great. I'm very pleased to hear that. And you were talking earlier about the demise of music education in the schools. Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you do something with these piano marathons to create awareness.
Yes.
Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, I just play for 12, 14 hours at a time. Try and get people interested in music back into the schools again. And they listen. They really do. And I make little speeches about it. I loved Ronald Reagan, dear friend. We started at the same radio station. And but he did one thing. He took music out of the schools. But he had a reason at the time, because we were in the Cold War with Russia, and we needed a bunch of scientists. And so he did that. But other governors around the country saw that he was saving so much money that they decided to cut. And it's really hurt.
anything that we can do, especially here in the state of California, where Mr. Schwarzenegger is cutting educational budgets all over the place. And, you know, my dad was an instrumental music teacher in the Oakland, California public schools.
Oh, really?
I would not know if he would have a job today.
I don't know. The people that last are the survivors. Now, I'm old enough to remember when vaudeville went out. And thousands of vaudeville entertainers were suddenly out of work when the movies came in. Now, very few of them survived. George Burns, Bob Hope, a few of those. But most of them just fell by the wayside. And this is life. I have no illusions about life. You and I are standing here now, and we may be in a major earthquake anytime. We don't know. And I try to adapt to every situation. To me, that's the hope of survival and the only way of survival. But I still wish they'd get music back into the schools, because I know what it does for people. Grades are improved. Oh boy, our driver's out there waiting for me and waving. I just do what I do best. And as I tell people at interview, I say, I'm a lousy golfer. And that always makes people feel better, because so many of them put me up on some kind of a pedestal. And this, here I go, but this disturbs me too. So many artists will make a great record or become very popular, and all of a sudden they are a great word about politics. They know how to handle everything in life. They talk about their religions. I'll say that for Chick. He's a Scientologist, but he's never pushed it with me. I appreciate that. I believe whatever works in life. If being born again turns you on, I'm with you 100%. If, on the other hand, you like some other religion, and as my father said, who had the largest Lutheran church in the country, there are many ways up the mountain. And I've kind of taken that from him.
And does this also include your feeling for discipline? Because, again, people may not know that before you turned to music, you were going to be a boxer.
Yes.
And then, of course, I imagine a strong father influence on the discipline portion of it. But going from the boxer and going into the music, into the performance field, the competitiveness, maybe the ego, all sorts of things. There's a drive there, but there's also a very strong discipline.
A very strong discipline, desire, and drive. Those are the three things that I go by. And there's very little difference between a left of the body and a left of the piano. It's the same action practically. And I always had very fast hands. But when I was in the Navy, I knew I could never be a champion because I usually won by decisions. I had such fast hands, but I didn't have that knockout punch that everybody wants to see in the first round. If you're going to be a successful boxer, you got to knock the guy out in the first round, as Tyson did.
Well, I have to tell you something. Today we seem to have lost the romance. I'll use that word in music.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the songs? The old days used to be everything about you, and then about the 70s onward, it became about me. Today there is no melody. Our radio stations, there are no radio stations that play, it seems like, the good standards outside of a special group on digital cable or satellite, but we don't have any more terrestrial radios. What are we going to do to keep this music on the menu for the people that A, want to hear it, and B, have not heard it and need to discover it?
Well, Lawrence Welk scared the heck out of me. He said, every time the hearse goes by, I lose another fan. And when you ask that question, Forrest, what happens when you die, when I die, and these kids have no background whatsoever about our kind of music? pretty scary.
It is.
But still I find that the Orientals especially, get the book by Long Long, Journey of 1,000 Miles, how his father practically, well, threatened his life, gave him a whole bunch of pills and said, take them, you're not practicing enough. And I see all the foreign kids come over and win all our contests because their parents are pushing them and pushing them hard. In fact, I can't think of the name of the girl that was just in the last Overture magazine, a famous cellist now. Her parents were tough on her. And she said, I hated him. I hated him. And she said, it was only after I got about 18 that I realized that I had musical talent. And she said, I went for it. And at the end of the article, she said, finally, last week, I called my parents, which we have not spoken for a week, for years, actually. I finally called them and told them how much I appreciated the fact that they made me practice. So discipline, drive, but then you have to have the desire. I think you have to have the desire first. Then you have the discipline to do it and the drive to keep with the discipline. I have a big sign. Discipline, drive, and desire.
I've got just two more quick questions, and we'll wrap this up, Roger. I had a good honor to interview Peggy Lee shortly before she passed away.
Yes, yes.
And as I mentioned to you earlier, I think that finding out what kind of music people personally enjoy or listen to is sort of the window to the soul. Now here, as you know, Peggy Lee was a great jazz singer and composer and so forth. And I said, Miss Lee, I said, do you have a piece of music or a particular genre that you really that means something to you, that's built you? She thought for a moment, and I was surprised. She says, the second movement of Mahler's Fifth, the Adagiata.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And she says that has had more of a spiritual effect on me and everything else. So Roger Williams, I'd like to ask you. You mentioned in the concert today that people say, what's your favorite piece of music? And you mentioned, well, what time of day is it? But
yes.
Is there any particular piece that's been with you all of your life that has had some sort of personal or special meaning?
Yeah. But it's a mistake if I expect it to have meaning to you. Because I had a man, who was it? Charlie came up and said, you played You'll Never Walk Alone yesterday while just rehearsing. He said, I started to cry. Now, I don't think it was particularly the song, You'll Never Walk Alone. He said it was his father's favorite song. And every time he heard it, he said, I start to cry because it's such a beautiful melody. And I think of my dad. And people do this all the time in my concerts. I hear them, like even a Laras Theme or something that I play, or Yellow Bird or whatever. They go back and think of where they first heard that song, who they heard it with. So it's hard for me to say. I love Chopin. I always have. His E major etude, to me, is the most beautiful melody I ever heard. And Chopin used to cry every time he played it. But that struck me. But that doesn't mean it's going to struck Forrest or anybody else. But I don't play from the head. I play from the heart.
I'm going to ask you one last thing to send a little message to our members from around the world of the Robert Farnon Society. If you would give us a little tribute to Bob or something, how you're familiar with his music, or
I just want to congratulate you folks. You have the best musical taste that I can imagine, because you could not pick a man who was more of a genius at what he did than Robert Farnon. And I mean that. I still play his things all the time. He had a certain thing, and I hope he was a lousy golfer. That makes me feel a little better. When I tell people I'm a lousy golfer, they think, well, gosh, good. It's something he doesn't do. I'm a great golfer, so I'm just as good as he is.
Wow.
And that makes everybody relax.
Well, I also have to say something about Roger Williams, too, and this came from our mutual friend, Phil Stout. And this will, I will share this because this tells me what a consummate perfectionist and musician you are. Years ago, you paid Phil Stout, when SRP was located in New York, a visit.
Yes.
And the way that Phil related to me it was that he said to him, you play a lot of my records, but there are other things that you don't play. What can I do to make things better?
Yes.
And that has always, Phil shared that with me recently, and he says, I'll never forget that and how special that was, because you don't have many musicians or performers that come in and will say, what can I do to make things better?
Well, especially a person like Phil, who listens to everyone. He listens to a lot more people than I do because that's all he does. I'm busy practicing the piano.
Wow.
But I had such respect for him and what he did. So I said, Phil, come on, help me. I said the same thing to David Benoit. I said, David, look, I said, I know what I do, but I like what you do. Now round off the edges, little things that I do that you think you would do differently. And I steal from everybody. And I'm proud of it.
Well,
Beethoven said the same thing.
Well, after yesterday, you can see who I steal from, so there you go.
Don't practice too hard. I got enough competition.
Roger Williams, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for being here, and just keep going on forever, will you?
I'm going to try, friend.
All right.
I'm only 84.
You're still, that's middle age.
And by the time you do this, well, I'll be 85. So.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.